Konnichiwa. Thanks to the Institute for Urban Strategies and to the Mori Foundation for bringing me here to Tokyo to speak with you and to learn from what you are doing in Tokyo. I was invited because in my last book, Naked City, which has been translated into Japanese, I asked what is happening to the authenticity of the city where I live, New York. And I would like to explore with you what the term authenticity means and how we see authenticity around us. I'm afraid that I speak for the low city. The next speaker might speak for the high city. And I speak for the city of everyday life. It's difficult to define authenticity or to define an authentic city. A justice of the United States Supreme Court once defined pornography by saying, "We know it when we see it." And that's the way I feel about an authentic city. In New York, our standards of authenticity are often defined by yesterday. What was the city like when we first encountered it as adults? Take Soho, for example, the wildly successful so-called artists district of Lower Manhattan, where now there are more chain stores, high class as well as mass market chain stores, than there are artist studios. What has happened to Harlem in Upper Manhattan, which used to be a center of political radicalism and black identity? It is still partly a center of black identity, but even more so, a very successful example of residential and to some degree commercial redevelopment. What has happened to the old industrial buildings along the rivers in New York City? Well, they have been replaced also. The feeling among many people who are long-time New Yorkers is that the neighborhoods that they knew and loved have died. How can we express the feeling of loss? How can we analyze the various changes in the structure of society, economy, and culture that we see in the built environment of the city? Should we say that these changes are simply an upscaling of the city where the buildings get taller and the prices get higher also? Or shall we say this is just a natural process of growth for the 21st century as it was for earlier periods? Should we say that there are new people and more people moving into the city? Or shall we look at the way the prices and the redevelopment have caused some of them to be displaced from the areas where they lived? Should we say that we are simply living in an age of intensive globalization and the changes that we see in the city are a reflection of the global economy and global culture? Or does globalization bring with it a soulless standardization of built forms as well as many other cultural forms? Or do we simply see, as in the store of IKEA, a change from a landscape of material production to a landscape of symbolic production and consumption? Do we see the disappearance of traditional cultures and perhaps the birth of new ones? Or should we simply say the city is different now? Well, the term authenticity has been used, especially in marketing, since the early 2000s to express a real essence of products as well as cities. And so I chose to use a term that is in widespread discourse, authenticity, to try to grasp the sense of loss in a city with current redevelopment strategies. But authenticity has contradictory meanings, as the advertising campaign of HSBC recently pointed out to us. The first meaning of authenticity is that a culture is very old, so old it dates from before history begins. On the other hand, we also use the word authenticity to refer to products of culture that are brilliantly new and never seen before. One meaning of authenticity that goes back in time is that authentic things are products of a group culture. On the other hand, we often speak of the work of an individual genius as authentic. When an art expert uses the term authenticity, they mean something that can be certified on the basis of objective standards. When we speak every day of authenticity, we speak about the way we feel. These subjective feelings cannot be certified. Often the term authenticity is used to speak about the aesthetic qualities of space and time. But when we use authenticity to talk about the built environment that we feel strongly about, we really are referring to our experience of living in space and time. These are contradictions that cannot be resolved. They are part of the very word authenticity. But one thing that may disturb us as analysts and as planners is that the view of the city from inside is different from the view from outside. If you are looking from outside, it is easy to use the word authenticity. But if you are living inside an authentic city, you don't think to use the word authenticity because this is your life. By the same token, when you just walk through a neighborhood or a district of the city, you may see the same things. You may see residents sitting outside on the sidewalk, but do you call that landscape distinctive, or do you just think it is normal? It's very important to ask who has the power to say what a landscape is. Often the people who have the power to describe a landscape are the beginnings of the power to change that landscape. I would say that in New York, I am most impressed by the foundation of a living authenticity in material production, everyday routines, and the continuation of edges between different cultures. I think that these three conditions are important to fight against standardization. For example, if we see the continuation of material production, which has more or less disappeared from the old meatpacking district of New York City, how can we see that production continued inside the office spaces? Here, for example, of the Red Bull company, not far from the meatpacking district. Can we maintain authenticity by keeping a juxtaposition of old and new buildings, as here in Soho? Can we maintain cultural edges between nature and the built environment, for example, on the High Line to the left or in Madison Square Park to the right? can we encourage a diversity not only of functions and cultural forms, but a diversity of people who will come to the cities usually through transnational migration. What we see instead, as Professor Ichikawa implied, is that the competition between cities for capital investment, for tourists, and for reputation creates a standardized set of the same redevelopment practices. Professor Ichikawa showed us very powerful images of skyscrapers in the centers of cities. I would call our attention also to the standardization of the development strategies that all come out of one global toolkit where people meet and talk and use the same kinds of ideas in different places. So that, for example, we see mixed-use high-rise developments, we see new waterfront developments, we see food trucks here outside the International Forum, and we also see the global diffusion of cultural symbols. And here we see Brooklyn brought to Shinjuku. And of course, the mega events of the world stage. The global toolkit of redevelopment strategies is based on the soft power of images and tastes, but also on the relatively hard power of rankings and branding mechanisms, so that the competition between cities is intensified and everyone looks to their competing cities to form their own ideas about the way their city should look. This creates perhaps too much standardization and unhealthy loss of authenticity. I was really asked not to speak about New York, but to speak about Tokyo, even though in New York I am an insider and in Tokyo I am an outsider. So let me speak a little bit about what I have seen that looks authentic to me in Tokyo, even though I am an outsider. I look at the form of the buildings. I look at who uses the buildings and what are the uses of the buildings. And I look to see a continuity between past and future. So, for example, for me, it's very important to preserve low scale. In Shimokitazawa, for example, where the old black market from after World War II has been demolished for redevelopment, or in Kurizaka, where the streetscape looks like many small streetscapes at night with restaurant signs and fairly low-rise houses. Local shopping streets, even though they face extreme competition from big stores, chains, and online retail shopping, those streets are so important for protecting a sense of local identity, whether the street is in Sendagi or Azabu-Juban, whether the shops are modest or like Mamagen, they produce a famous product for more than 100 years. It is these shops and the personal presence of the owners and workers in the shops that create a very strong sense of local identity and continuity. So as we build new parts of cities, let us try to preserve the space for face-to-face relations. Even though this shop has a Coca-Cola machine to one side, indicating that culture, local culture, is never completely closed to the outside. My research partners, Professor Machimura, Professor Hattori, and Ms. Kim, who collaborated with me on my new book on local shopping streets, a book called Global Cities, Local Streets, developed the term globalized authenticity to express the sense that in Tokyo, the local is always global. We know that everywhere the global must come to rest in the built environment, so that the global always becomes local. But Tokyo's gift to urbanists around the world is to make this globalized sense of local authenticity. That is what should continue, but strongly grounded in material production, edges between cultures, and the sustaining, the continuing of the juxtaposition between the old and the new, the low and the high. Thank you.